like looking for when you come in through SPD? What are things that I should be looking for? And really having that, I guess, collaboration. And also, every like once a month, we have our SPD collab as a whole like system, and our eye infection preventionists are invited to that as well. And so it's a whole, again, like team effort in that as well.
Infection stops where information starts. Welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast, where knowledge is your strongest defense. Broadcasting from the front lines of healthcare, we dive into the strategies, science, and stories shaping infection prevention today. Each episode, we connect you with experts on real-world insights to help you stop the spread of healthcare-associated infections, protect patients, and strengthen your practices as an infection prevention and public health expert. When the right information reaches the right people, lives are saved.
Hello and welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast. My name is Garrett Hollembeak and I'm here with Jill Holdsworth. Today we're talking with Chase Elms about collaboration between infection prevention and sterile processing. Stick with us and we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Brought to you from the studios of Healthcare HQ. Let's get into it. This is Transmission Control.
Hello and welcome to the Transmission Control Podcast. My name is Garrett Hollembeak, infection preventionist. I'm joined here with Jill Holdsworth. Jill, how are you doing today?
Hey guys, I'm Jill Holdsworth. I'm Infection Prevention Manager at Emory University Hospital Midtown in Atlanta, Georgia, and so excited to be kicking off this Transmission Control podcast series with our guest here, Chase Elms. Chase, do you want to give us some background on yourself?
Yeah, so I'm the supervisor of sterile processing at St. Louis Magic Valley in Twin Falls, Idaho. I have a bachelor's degree in exercise physiology. And yeah, great to be on the podcast today.
Chase, you may not know this, but my master's degree is in exercise physiology. I never meet anybody else that has the same background as me when we're doing this crazy stuff in healthcare, and we went into something completely different than we plan to do with ex-phys. That's awesome.
That actually highlights what we're talking about this season and this episode specifically, which is the role that other backgrounds, other career paths, and one specifically sterile processing has in our field of infection prevention. So this lines up perfectly.
And we didn't plan this. We didn't plan this part of the podcast. I had no idea that Chase had that background, and I'm sure he didn't know that about me. But that's so cool. I always say that I should go back and talk to my school and say, you know what, you're going into ex-phys. You may think you're going to be a personal trainer or something else, and there's all these other things that you can do with your degree. And that's exactly kind of the theme here in one of our topics of going into infection prevention with all these different backgrounds. So really cool segue we didn't even know that we were going to have.
Now my question though is, Jill, is your deadlift as good as Chase's? We were talking before.
I don't even know which one the deadlift is, but I doubt I could even bench the bar. So I'm pretty sure Chase has me in all of those categories.
That'll be the part two. Yeah. Well, this is awesome. So, Chase, your background is really unique because sterile processing is something that we all hear about. It affects every single patient that has a surgical procedure. You know, my background is in sterile processing. I know Jill has done tremendous work in championing SPD in the IP world. And so getting into this, I want to just have you give us a broad overview of what sterile processing does for infection prevention.
Well, obviously, like sterile processing sterilizes all the instruments, right? So we're preventing infections from happening, making sure everything is 100% clean, 100% sterile, 100% of the time. So really, I mean, we are, I guess when you think of like a body, right, you have like infection prevention as like the brain, which, you know, kind of makes the rules and kind of regulates everything. And sterile processing is like the hands, right? Like we're the ones that actually are performing everything to make sure that those infection prevention policies are followed.
Chase, how do you feel like the IP can fit in best with that workflow that you just described without being so much as like the police? And how can we be more of like the friend and partner?
Yeah, I think part of it is having a relationship with like the leadership team, with your personal like IP person, right? So my infection preventionist that I have here at my hospital, she is fantastic. She is, I think, actually our chapter president, APIC here. She is great, and she comes in rounds in our department. She lets us know when she's coming. And then, you know, I'm able to round with her in sterile processing, and then she goes through like the ORs. But we're always on the same page. She's asking questions. She's talking to my staff, asking my staff questions, you know, kind of putting them on the spot a little bit of like, hey, like, do you know your stuff? Especially because we have so many new staff recently. We've had a big turnover. So a lot of fresh blood, especially in day shift. So just making sure that she's comfortable, everybody knows who she is. I think that's like a big, good first step is having that partnership and that visibility with each other.
I think you described pretty much the ideal that every SPD leader and every IP want to get to, and it takes work to get there. So I know I was talking to one of our IPs today, and she went down to SPD, saw some things that maybe they were correct, maybe they weren't correct, but, you know, we didn't really know. And that rapport, you know, they're fairly new in their role. The SPD leaders fairly, as you turnover is huge in both fields. So how did you get to that ideal state that you described?
Part of it's like personality, right? Like I'm very communicative. I like to talk to people. And so when she came in and like was rounding the first couple times I met her, I was the one that kind of reached out to her and was like, hey, like, so what are you looking for? Like, what are the type of things that you're like looking for when you come in through SPD? What are things that I should be looking for? And really having that, I guess, collaboration. And also every like once a month we have our SPD collab as a whole like system, and our eye infection preventionists are invited to that as well. And so it's a whole, again, like team effort in that as well.
No, I think that's really important what you said, that your system SPD collaborative meeting, the IPs are invited. That's something that we do here as well. And I think that has really been beneficial on both ends. And I love that you do that as well. And I think that's something that some systems have to get to. But once you learn to work together and you learn that everybody has questions that you can learn from, it's a great thing. My question to you, Chase, is what do you feel like has been really helpful that the IP's asking and looking for? Like what is that the IP asking your staff and that our IPs can learn from what you guys are doing?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it's kind of basic like JCO questions, like what do you do when you see tape on an instrument? What is the tape supposed to look like? I mean, we have zero tape on all of our stuff now. That was like a big IP push earlier this year before our JCO, you know, Joint Commission survey. But just kind of those basic Joint Commission type questions, looking for like stains on the ceilings, but asking staff like, oh, what do you look for when you see, how do you test the instrument, right? Like, what do you see when you see like brown staining? Like, what do you do, or what do you do when you see the brown staining? Just like simple questions like that. I'm asking them how to test stuff, talking about water quality. That's been a big issue recently. Just kind of basic questions. Make sure they know how the indicators work.
You may not control everything that goes on, stained ceiling tiles, water quality. Those are kind of bigger facility-wide, system-wide even concerns. But if it doesn't get seen in your department and IP is not there to help collaborate and help, address or raise the flag on some of that, they can get missed or go years and years without, reaching resolution. So one thing that you said that I really liked was that IP lets you know when they're coming into your department. And I know when I was an SPD manager, we had kind of a time frame, and we knew that, IPs, we do a lot of rounding we never want to make them like, oh, gotcha. So we want to see things in their natural state. But SPD is a totally different environment. So what is the benefit that you've seen of having some heads up about when they're going to be there?
I think the biggest thing is maybe having some pre-prepared questions. Like if I know they're coming and there's been something that we've maybe had a couple of questions about, we can kind of ask them maybe in person, kind of show them what we're thinking. And then, just having a little bit of staff not being so nervous as well, because sometimes they feel like, oh, they're being put on the spot. They're being like, hey, just letting you guys know, tomorrow, 10 a.m., infection prevention is going to be coming in and rounding on our department. Right. So just be prepared to, answer questions. They might talk to staff and that kind of stuff.
I will say from my standpoint, as an IP, my advice to IPs is to stop in often, and not just when you're rounding. Just kind of stop in and talk to people. And that's what I do. I'm not always rounding when I stop in to SPD. I sometimes just go in to see how people are doing, to talk to people, say hi, because that kind of takes that, nervousness off of people, because you're just kind of saying, hey, how's it going? Is there anything I can help you with? You're not doing your official rounds, because as IPs, we get labeled a lot as the auditors. We're always looking for hand hygiene compliance, and so if you start to just kind of be a regular figure in whatever area you're covering, then it's not so much of a nervous thing when you're around actually doing the rounds, because people just expect you to be there anyways. And so that's kind of how I've started to do it over the last few years, is just kind of be there all the time. And they just kind of expect me. They actually find it weird when I'm not around for a while. They're like, man, we haven't seen you in a while. Do you not like us anymore? And so I'm not so much of a scary thing anymore from when I first started.
That's so important, because as staff answers those questions, and they have, opportunity to kind of go through the motions, and, you play how you practice. So if you can get more time speaking with somebody who's asking about your processes, by the time the surveyor comes around, that's old hat. So Chase, have you seen your team members, even newer staff or staff in orientation, have you seen them get more comfortable answering those questions as IP is rounded more?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. For sure.
Yeah, and I think too, it depends on if your staff is new, if the IPs are new. So I think if you're listening to this podcast and you're a new IP, you just have to kind of get comfortable with SPD by spending more time down there. And if you're listening to this podcast and you're new in SPD, you just have to get comfortable with your IP. It always takes a while to get comfortable with anything, but as IPs, we have to spend time in places before we're comfortable. But the more you're there, the more comfortable you are. And if you're brand new to IP, spending time anywhere is going to let you feel more comfortable, and ask questions. Just spend time down there and ask questions. SPD doesn't come naturally to many people at all. So you're going to need someone to help teach you the things. And just standing down there, observing, watching, listening, that is how you're going to feel more comfortable, because, it's like children. They can sense when you're nervous. So if you're nervous, then everybody in SPD is going to know that you're not comfortable, and and no one's going to want to trust you. So if you are down there to learn, then it's going to start off on a really good foot.
Now, that's a great call out too, because this whole season is about new IPs and the orientation journey. Because it is not you learn it for 2 weeks and then you know everything there is about IP. I know, and I haven't been in the field very long, but it takes you maybe a few months to get your feet even underneath you. And then it's years and years and years to feel like you're doing a good job. So, Chase, if I'm a new IP in your facility, what are some key things that I should know or get familiar with about sterile processing?
I feel like probably decontamination, because that is probably the most stringent. It has there's a lot of policies and regulations that go back into decon. And I think it'll probably be the hardest to learn and just the most to learn. So I think honestly, starting from decon and going from there, just go through the whole process through washer, then assembly, sterilization. But yeah, definitely decontamination, I would say, is the best place to start. How are they cleaning the instruments after they come out of surgery? Are they flushing correctly? All that kind of stuff.
I think you have to spend a concentrated amount of time in decon too. Don't do an hour in decon and then go do an hour in assembly or something. You have to spend months observing decon and even pulling IFUs and kind of following them and just watching and learning. And I also have used the HSPA textbook for my IPs and had them kind of read those chapters while they're observing in decon, and that seems to help too, just to have something to read. But yeah, I totally agree. I feel like you have to kind of start at the beginning.
Yeah, it's a great resource there too, because if it isn't cleaned right, no matter how well we do the rest of the process, if we don't catch it there, and that's something I hope people take away from sterile processing is there's debates and questions about, are we cost generating? Are we a profit generating center? But really it's the solution generating center. The problem is that we had contaminated stuff. We need to get clean, sterile, and on time, up to the room for the next patient. And that doesn't happen without sterile processing. So I think raising the visibility of that is super important. Now, Chase, with your team, have you ever had a recommendation come from an IP? Because we don't know everything and there's always new things to learn. Have you ever had a recommendation that maybe you disagreed with, or an observation that you said, that may not be 100? And I don't want you to put your IP on the spot, but just in broad terms,
Yeah, my personal IP, no. But there are system-wide IP people that have tried to push certain things that we haven't all agreed with. And it's definitely one of those things where you can tell which IPs are very integrated into their SPD and know enough about the job versus those that aren't, because those that aren't, when they give a recommendation and all the SPD leadership is but that's not how that works. It's one of those things where it's I can't remember a specific type of recommendation. I feel there was one that we had come up not too long ago, but I can't remember what it was specifically. But everybody in SPD leadership was that doesn't make sense. It does not make sense to do it that way. It ends up being more work for SPD in the long run. And so it ended up not getting passed because we were just kind of shut it down. But yeah, there has been times where stuff, has tried to come through and it's well, it's not something that is necessary to, keep patients safe. It's kind of one of a minuscule thing that, sure, in a perfect world, it would be nice to have that one thing, but the way we're operating right now, it does not make sense. So
I think that's a really good point that you said there, because there's what's nice to have and then what's required to have. And anytime you go down into a department, it's easy to kind of, I'll use the word nitpick, but about maybe operational concerns or things, efficiency things. And you do a fair bit of work on quality improvement and, efficiency things anyway. So I think that's a gift in the organization. But it is good for IP when we make a recommendation, we have to be able to pull it from a standard, either a manufacturer's instructions for use, a facility policy, and then really put the black and white to it and say, this is in text writing. And then you're not trying to convince somebody to do something. It's, this is what's best for the patient, and we can see how it translates to patient risk.
I think what's hard for IPs, especially recently, is with Joint Commission standards, and I know some follow DNV, but now with so much falling under the IC chapter, we feel this kind of like heavy burden on us to be more involved in sterile processing. And there are a large group of IPs that don't have a large amount of knowledge in sterile processing. And so I think that's a real opportunity for infection prevention in general, but that may be where some of that's coming from in your system, Chase, with maybe that one person that was making a nitpicking recommendation. It's like IPs feel like, okay, now all of this is on our shoulders. We really have to make sure we're doing every little tiny thing right, because it all falls under us in Joint Commission. But it's like we have to also be able to look at the bigger picture and make sure that we're following standards, we're following recommendations, looking at what our policies say and working together, and not finding that one tiny thing that we want to try and change that really doesn't matter.
That's a really good point. Now, have you had, on the victory side, have you had a really successful intervention that came out of collaboration with your IP?
Yeah, I would say like our tape removal project was like our big one. All our clinics were taped. We had emergency sets in the OR that were taped. And so working with infection prevention to reach out to the clinics, right? So we have our ambulatory infection prevention persons as well. And so having them reach out to the clinics, gather all the instruments. They were the ones that went to the clinics and grabbed all their instrumentation to bring them back to the facility. And then working with our repair company as well to help remove all that tape. And then we annealed all the instruments with like the laser annealing on all of them, and then got them back through SPD, washed and repackaged. And we did close to 30 clinics in like a week and a half. So maybe like full 2 weeks, we had over 10,000 instruments, come to our department in a very small amount of time, on top of all the other stuff we were already doing. So it was like, on top of like keeping the ORs running, we had all this extra workload to do. But in the end, it was a great project, and we haven't had any issues. Once in a while, someone will find some super old set somewhere that has tape on it still. But even loaners that come in, we always ask the rep, like, hey, we need to take this tape off. Like, we don't have tape in our OR at all.
That's a big kind of hot topic for Joint Commission surveys right now, too.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's an easy one for them to find, and to find it not wrapped correctly or...
Yeah, the IFU on that is so specific that, you're changing that tape every, 2 weeks because it gets, it dries out and starts cracking or peeling so quickly that it's a constant keep up. So...
I know everybody listening, their ears just perked up, because tape is not only a big compliance thing, but it's everywhere. Anytime we go to a site assessment, it's tape. Now, Jill, I want to throw this to you, because we obviously want to meet Joint Commission standards, and we want to be compliant there, but everything that we do should be driven towards patient safety. So can you tell us a little bit about why tape is such a concern for IP, beyond just the Joint Commission doesn't want it in there?
Yeah. So imagine the tape on those instruments, and I have seen some pretty bad tape jobs on instruments, but tape ends up everywhere. So we don't really allow tape anywhere, but since we're talking about SPD, just imagine it on those instruments. Imagine that it's a bad tape job, it's overlapping, it's peeling up, and it has that adhesive residue that is just stuck to the instruments, and now it's picking up every little bit of bacteria that it's collecting along its journey in the OR, everywhere that it's going. And that's why we don't allow tape on clinical floors and in clinical areas, because it's a breeding ground for bacteria. And so when we're talking about things that are allowed, we're talking about like putty or something that's not going to leave behind an adhesive residue to hang up signs, or hooks that you can hang a sign on. You have to have laminated things instead of tape. That's the reason why we don't want tape on instruments, because when you pull that tape off, and that's why Chase said we had to go to the instrument repair folks, and I'm sure a lot of other people have had to do that too, because when you pull that tape off, it doesn't just come off clean. It leaves that adhesive residue behind, and then it's going to keep picking up that bacteria, and we're going to keep spreading it. So you have to get that adhesive residue cleanly off of there, and a lot of times that's not that simple. And so it's a big job. And when you're thinking about your next Joint Commission visit, if you get cited for this, they come back in 30 days. And it is really difficult to go through your entire fleet of instruments, get all of the tape off, get all the adhesive residue off of everything. And think if you have 30 clinics like Chase, and do all of that within 30 days before they come and do their revisit. So it's best if you go ahead and start now before you get cited for it when you have your regulatory survey.
Love it. So proactive approach as opposed to reactive, because you're always going to find those little pockets of things that didn't make it through.
And this is a hard one. And you may find that your clinics are actually taping themselves, and you never want someone outside of SPD putting tape on your instrumentation on their own. You probably don't want tape at all, but you'll find some strange things happening where tape ends up on your instrumentation on its own outside of your department. So you have to keep close tabs on your instruments. And if you do allow tape, which tape can be safely done if maintained correctly, but if you are allowing tape, it needs to be done and maintained in SPD and not being placed wherever they want to put it on.
Yeah, you will see rolls of tape and label maker tape and all sorts of things. It's the Wild West out there sometimes. So this was obviously a really big project that you undertook. I'd love to hear that IP was the one physically going to these sites and getting instrumentation. That's a boots on the ground approach. Now, with other things like capital or new equipment, additional staff, how do you see IP being able to support other needs in your department? How can we help essentially?
I think when it comes to, I guess as far as capital goes, like needing new sterilizers, needing new equipment, right? Especially at facilities that are quite a bit older, right? We have a sterilizer in our department that came from our old regional hospital. I think the date on there is 1982, right? It's an old Steris crank wheel. Like, it hasn't worked in like months. Then we've used it a couple times in the year and a half I've worked here because it's super old. But like, old equipment like that sometimes, can get buildup of stuff. The water quality, how good was the water quality back in the 80s, the 90s? And the standards back then, and it's been used, but it hasn't been thoroughly cleaned, all that kind of stuff. But again, a lot of facilities are getting the black flake or a lot of the brown staining on like filters and tray liners, right? The tray liners, the brown staining. So stuff like that where it's like, oh, hey, like, is this an infection prevention issue? And, okay, cool, now we need to fix our sterilizer. Now we need a new sterilizer and not one from the 1980s, getting that one switched out first, and then, okay, we have these other two sterilizers that are newer, they were here when the hospital was built in 2011, but maybe, we should look at potentially switching those out in the next couple of years as well. So especially, I think sterilizers are a big one as far as capital goes, just keeping IP informed on that kind of stuff, and having them, they might not be the person that makes the end decision on whether you can or cannot buy it, but having an infection preventionist back you up on that kind of stuff, I think goes a long way with the people that do make those final decisions. I think SPD, even the SPD leadership saying, hey, we need a new sterilizer, it's going to be like, oh, well, of course you want a new sterilizer. Everybody wants the new stuff, right? Like, everybody would love to have new prep, but too bad. But if you have someone from infection prevention that's backing up like, no, we need this new thing, and this is why, I think that goes a long way in helping convince ours.
I love it. That is the ideal state, is IP backing up on, one, identifying what is an infection control risk, and then two, being able to support frontline leaders like yourself. Now, last thing that we wanted to really highlight here is you're coming from a background, that's different. A lot of IPs are coming from nursing or lab and sometimes pharmacy background. There's not a ton of us that are coming from that device reprocessing world. So with IPs that are coming from a different background, what are some of the strengths of having, different career path, different emphasis, different kind of vision for that stuff?
I think biggest thing is just like, again, that point of view, right? Having someone infection prevention from sterile processing, well, now I can help sterile processing better than potentially someone that came from nursing, right? Like, yeah, they're going to be better in maybe some of the clinical settings more than I would. But part of that is, cross-training and cross-shadowing the clinical versus non-clinical stuff. But I think that's where, as an IP team, we can help each other out, right? But yeah, I think different perspective, knowing just how SPD runs in general, knowing regulations, standards, because that's all I feel like infection prevention is as well, right? Sterile processing is all ran on standards and regulations. Infection prevention is the same, it's just more intense and a very broader spectrum. So really, to me, it seems like a very good stepping stone to, kind of go into infection prevention from sterile processing, because it's just a bigger scope of what you're already been doing.
Our roles really do overlap a lot in the way that we function and how we follow certain standards. So yeah, I definitely agree. It's easy to learn about each other's roles and responsibilities if you're willing to do that. I think that's part of the bulk of it. You have to be willing to have an open mind and want to learn and be willing to learn about what each other does as IPs and SPD professionals. And we're not here to attack each other. We're here to work together. And once we break down those walls and realize we're partners, once we learn more about each other's roles, then it truly can bring up so much more success to both ends.
Chase, I want to thank you as we close out today about your insights. And these are the real practical stories of successes and, learning that we want both sterile processing professionals, IP professionals to hear from the field, really. It's great to see something out there in research, but hearing how it works in the real world is pretty impactful. So I want to thank you so much for not only keeping our patients safe, but for your expertise and collaboration with IP.
We appreciate you, Chase.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Today we talked with Chase Elms about the role of infection prevention in sterile processing. He gave us some really cool tips on how to engage IPs more in the sterile processing department and how he has developed a really great working relationship with his IPs and even how they've engaged the IPs more at a system level. And even what some of the things that his IP asks and engages his team members on in his department on their daily rounds.
Yeah, this was great because we got to see a very real-world blueprint for good collaboration between sterile processing and infection prevention. And we all need more of that, right? IP is all about collaboration. So it was great to hear some of the solutions that they've put in place at his facility. We're excited to continue this journey of collaboration, this journey of orientation for new IPs. Chase had some great highlights on what a new IP might think or want to know as they step into sterile processing. So for the Transmission Control podcast, we want to thank you all for keeping our patients safe. Thank you, Jill Holdsworth and Chase Elms. Just remember that infection stops where information starts.
Thanks for tuning in to the Transmission Control Podcast, where infection stops because information starts. If you enjoyed this episode, let us know. Connect with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and share this episode with your team. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and keep transmission under control.